So as anthropologists came to look at societies all across the world and all across time, we realized that we were going to need terminology to refer to the different ways people organize themselves as societies. Different ways have been proposed. One of the most popular still to this day, it's quite old, it's about 60 years old, and it's not always the best, but it is the most widespread, is band, tribe, chiefdom, and state. I say it's not always the best because there are societies that don't fit that pattern very well. I mentioned this before in one of the earlier archaeology lectures, but you have societies in like Ice Age Europe that were building big old mammoth houses. Clearly, that requires work of hundreds, if not thousands, of people and probably some kind of centralized authority figures, but there were probably bans for most of the year. And so it's like, what do you call that thing? Or you have like this one specific indigenous Amazonian group that Claude Levi-Strauss, famous anthropologist, wrote about. I'm blinking on their name right now. Arrow? I can't remember. Anyways, he talks about that they would cycle between wet and dry season down in tropical Amazon rainforest. And depending on the time of year, they either had a leader of the village who like really strictly told everybody what to do, like garden this way, versus out and about in the dry season, they kind of split into smaller groups and kind of just do their own thing. So like, what do you call that? It's super hierarchical part of the year and not the others. So band, tribe, chiefdom, state, not a perfect system. There is definitely lots of cases that don't fall neatly into that. And it's also a little confusing because nowadays, of course, states, right, which we'll talk about in a second, cover the entire world. Bands, tribes, chiefdoms, though, did historically exist, and in some cases still do exist, but under the broader authority of a state. So recognizing that it's an imperfect system, nonetheless, we'll be learning it today. Band, tribe, chiefdom, state. We need a vocabulary to refer to the different ways in which societies handle control and leadership. So I want to ask you, what do all these have in common? So this is some logos of the two major political parties in the United States, the GOP and the Democratic Party. And it is also a three other third parties. So Green Party, I don't know if that's even their official logo. It's like sort of unofficially, I think, the porcupine or the hedgehog, or porcupine, but the Libertarian Party, and then Socialist Party USA. And so what do all of these have in common, right? Their politics are obviously very, very different from each other, sometimes profoundly so on seemingly the most basic issues of governance. And yet, if there is a thing they all have in common, it is this, the assumption of a state form of society, by which we mean a government, right? When you vote, there's not an option for like mobile band with no leader, nor formal leader, or informal leader that, is powerful or not, depending on how we're feeling that day. That's not a thing. We have a formalized government. We disagree profoundly on what it is and how we use it, but we agree that there is one, generally speaking, across the political spectrum or across most of the political spectrum. So you might be saying, well, yeah, duh, that's how societies work. There are governments. And yet that's actually not quite the case anthropologically. In fact, there are many examples of societies that don't have what we would think of as a government and are organized according to some totally different kind of logic. So that's where we have band, tribe, chiefdom, and state, which you read about and hopefully have a sense of now. The first one I'll talk about is the one that's by far and away the dominant form now and is what we live in, and that is a state. By that, I do not mean the state of Alaska or the state of California or something like that. I don't mean a state in that sense. What I mean is instead how anthropologists use the term to mean a large society, usually, hundreds of thousands, millions, with a centralized, full-time designated government that enforces laws and generally has the ability to enforce their laws by force. And that is recognized as a thing that government does, and that it does it within some kind of defined territory. Indeed, at the international level, oftentimes if we consider something a country or not has a lot to do with, do they effectively control a territory and how long do they effectively control that territory and the people within it? So that is the idea of a state form of society. Very, very large, centralized, has a centralized full-time government. It enforces formal laws, usually written, and may use force, whether that's putting somebody in a prison or physical harm, to control those laws. So one anthropologist, Kenneth Guest, says an autonomous regional structure of political, economic, military rule with a centralized government authorized to make laws and use force to maintain order and defend territory. That's basically saying what I was saying. I think I said it better. Just kidding, Kenneth Guest. But not really. Interestingly, states only ever emerge with agriculture or industrial agricultural groups, things like the Egyptian pharaohs, right? I say only ever emerge. I should say instead, I already disagree with myself. That's not a good start to a lecture. Almost only ever emerges. We have exceptions. arguably. The Calusa in what is now known as Florida, the Calusa, arguably monarchy, is a good example of an exception where there was a large population density in part because of like shellfish and marine resources right there on the coast, and where they had a really strict hierarchy that we might consider to be a state. And so there's exceptions. Indeed, I just talked about one earlier on. Arguably, the Natchez Great Sun is an exception, potentially, if we consider that more of a horticultural group. But generally speaking, states don't come about until we have agriculture, or they only come about among agricultural societies or ones with industrial agriculture. And you might ask yourself why. And one of the reasons, there's been a lot of theories to try to develop that, or to try to explain that, like the hydraulic theory of stork formation, which basically says that states emerge as they control irrigation. We see that with some Amazonian groups. We see that with, sorry, I blanked on it for a second, with ancient pharaohs, things like that. There's also the surplus theory of state formation, which I've already talked to you about quite a bit. The idea that as more food per capita, less people have to be involved, a complicated trading system emerges. Eventually, people come to control that and be full-time politicians. So that's the idea of a state. And states, of course, are incredibly diverse. They can range from very, very democratic and representative of the people to incredibly autocratic and dictatorial, where the people, whether there are literally elections or not, the people have very little actual control over what's going on. And there's everything in between, right? And indeed, there can even be things where you have a democracy, or you have a democracy with a monarch, like in Britain, and that monarch may have a lot of authority or relatively little authority, all things considered. So all sorts of different forms, and with very little in common other than that they agree on this idea of governments and borders. And of course, if one lives in a state society, as effectively we all do in the 21st century, one may find that the state is involved in many, many, many aspects of one's life. The government, we should say. Everything from, certifying that you were born, somebody was born here, here's your certificate, to sort of schools tending to be run by governments, rules about vaccinations connected to schools, although in the US that tends to have a lot of exceptions, such as for religious reasons, driving, licensing people to drive, police, employment, taxes, right? You sort of never avoid the government. You get it right when you're a baby, all throughout your childhood as in school, anytime you drive a car, anytime you're at work and part of your paycheck goes to the government, anytime you're married and want that to actually be legally recognized, even in sort of like how people deal with children, right? There's obviously the government involved with that, rightfully. And so as far as like making sure that there's not abuse, and in other ways as well. And then even like death, right? Surely the government will leave me alone when I croak, but no, there's ways of sort of how do you dispose of a body. There's legal and illegal ways in which when you die, your family can bury you or not. And then there's also things like the quote unquote death tax, the estate tax, right? As far as if somebody's quite wealthy, what happens to their wealth. So government is involved in all sorts of aspects of our life. So the point is, though, that for many, many, many parts of human history and in many parts of the world, that didn't really look like that at all. Indeed, it's sort of become more so over time, even in societies with that. So we can talk about then bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states, right? This is what we're used to, but there's lots of other things that have historically existed. This is an imperfect chart, though a common one. But one of the things I want you to notice is how tightly it tends to be related to subsistence and towards population size, although not always. Bands then are often groups of 50 to 100, sometimes a little smaller, sometimes a little bigger, sometimes really bigger, but generally speaking, relatively small, often mobile, not always, often forager groups, not always. The key point here is no centralized government, no coercive authority, no permanent leader, and pretty small. And so that doesn't mean literally no leader, but no permanent leader that people can't sort of do away with if needs be. Most social decisions, most decisions as a community are made by influence, like the leader's like, hey guys, we should do this, or consensus. Very often bands are run on sort of most decisions get made by prominent members of the community sitting around the fire and talking it out, or maybe everybody in the community, or other informal means, like we don't do X because of a religious system of thinking, rather than sort of a centralized government where somebody can like show up and say, do this or I put you in jail. That's just not a thing. That's not what a band is. It's the opposite of a band. That would be unthinkable. I say unthinkable, that's not really right. I would say it would be unfeasible. People would not allow it. Bands generally are familiar with the idea of empires and monarchies and things. Indeed, they are often sort of trying to avoid them, but they sort of actively choose not to have that. And partly because, in a band society, one of the reasons you wouldn't have coercive authority, not the least of which is if you're mobile, it's hard to like jail somebody. But a bigger issue is if you are being a really heavy-handed leader that's trying to tell people you must do X, Y, or Z. In band societies, it tends to be much easier than our own to say, I am done with this society. I am going to go to the next band over there or just start my own band. That sort of freedom of movement and association is a major reason why it would be hard for somebody, even if they were super like, I want to be everybody's boss, to actually become everybody's boss, because you can say no thanks, or you can still stay in the band and just say make me, and they don't really have an effective way to make you. There's no standing police force or military when you don't have food surplus, for one thing, and for all sorts of other reasons there's not really a way to make them usually. And so I'm not trying to imply that violence can't happen, especially against those who haven't followed social norms. I'm trying to suggest, though, that that's not the normal operating procedure for decisions. It's fundamentally egalitarian. The power is distributed equally, more or less, among the adults. An example of what that might look like is a group I've mentioned, I think, before, the Owanzi, where there are band leaders, and indeed it's hereditary and it's male, but their power is very, very small. They tend to walk in front when you're moving around, hunting or whatever, and they tend to coordinate movement. Like, let's camp over there tonight. Is that power? Sure, that's power. Is that power at the same level of telling you who you can marry and win, or you have to stay in this territory or else, or we are all going to go to battle group and you don't have a say in the matter? No, this is obviously very different than like a contemporary government. The leaders have very little authority, and most authority they have is by influence, by persuasion. And indeed, most decisions are made by consensus. The headman is never a judge, jury, or executioner. They're not really enforcing laws as such. And if you don't like what the leader decides in a Wanzi society, you can go ahead and leave, generally speaking. What's interesting about that is we tend to sometimes think that that just sort of happens, and bands are just sort of like that until hierarchy develops. What's interesting is that some bands show us that people are familiar with hierarchies, may have even had some historically, and have actively chosen to work against it, which brings up this term leveling mechanism. A leveling mechanism in anthropology is when a culture has developed a certain way of making sure that hierarchies don't develop. A good example is the classic reading Eating Christmas in the Kalahari by Richard Lee, who was an anthropologist. He was doing fieldwork with Wanzi people. He wanted to show his gratitude after a year of fieldwork. He bought them a very, very large cow to be slaughtered at a community feast for Christmas, which at the time they were calling basically the white man God's birthday. Anyways, he, for like months or a month leading up to Christmas, basically everybody made fun of the cow, and they're like, that's so skinny, it's terrible, it's not going to feed anybody. And he was getting super, super angry because he's like, that's a great cow, I spent good money on it, it's a huge cow, what are you talking about, it's skinny, it's huge. And then at the end, they all had a big feast and they all loved the cow and got super, super full. And they were like, oh yeah, that was awesome meal. And he's like, why did you make fun of me and tell me it was a skinny cow then? And people said, basically, we do that to make sure people don't get a big head, right? As one person said, when a young man kills much meat, he comes to think of himself as a chief or a big man, and he thinks the rest of us are his servants or inferiors. We cannot accept this. We refuse one who boasts, for someday his pride will make him kill somebody, right? It's interesting that they're like exactly pointing to this idea of coercive authority. So we always speak of his meat as worthless. This way we cool his heart and make him gentle. So a leveling mechanism, keeping people sort of humble so they don't start to be a coercive or hierarchical authority figure. Interesting. Tribes. Tribes are the next form of social organization in that list of band, tribe, chiefdom, and state. Usually connotes a larger population than a band, but still no fully centralized power. And kind of the distinguishing feature here is that they tend to have smaller groups, basically smaller bands or villages, but then those become unified by broader pan-tribal mechanisms, another fancy word that basically means some kind of thing in your society other than a government that keeps multiple smaller groups together as one larger group, at least some of the time. So that can be something like kinship, lineages, or clan. That can be something like religion. We get together to do a ceremony together. Aboriginal Australians, really good example, coming together sometimes for ceremonies and then other times potentially separating out. There might even just be shared language, or we cooperate on major issues. A really good example of this is the Lakota tribe historically, and more generally the Assoti-Sekowim, the Seven Council Fires, which included the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota peoples, where you had smaller groups or peoples that would get together as broader groups, especially in, for example, when you were needing to defend yourselves by land encroachment by other groups, so for war purposes, or getting together to do Sundance, a collective ceremony that helps rejuvenate the land and show sacrifice for your community, and a common language as well among the Lakota. So these kinds of things allowed people to very quickly ally up when there was battles with the US government, but at the same time have a pretty flexible, loose social structure that could sort of not exactly split apart, but not always be united under like a war leader, like oftentimes they want it to be, right? So it's sort of this more flexible arrangement sometimes. Good example. Alaska, prior to being part of America, and to some degree prior to becoming part of Russia, there's a lot of examples of what I just described. So for example, among which in people historically, people would often be hanging out with 2 or 3 families, kind of hanging out, hunting, fishing, gathering together, but you would sometimes get into larger groups of, 50 to 100, where for temporary reasons, such as we're going to all build a caribou corral together, right, and hunt it together, or we're going to have sort of a ceremony together, run a trade together, right? So that's kind of an example. Now, notably, and very importantly, since we're in Alaska, tribes in this context does not mean tribal governments in the way we use that term nowadays. That's not the same term. We're using it instead to convey a certain kind of social organization that predates states as such. In a tribe, power, much like in bands, tends to be pretty fluid and informal, but a difference is here that you do sometimes have these like formal leadership positions, but admittedly sometimes bands do too. And in both cases, it tends to be achieved, by which I mean you're not born into it, or you are born into it, but you can very quickly lose it. If people don't respect you as a leader, even if your dad or mom was a leader, they can very quickly say, nope, this other person is the leader. The leadership tends to be more informal and based on your ability to persuade people that your ideas are good ideas, that you're hardworking, that you're going to work well as a leader, and people may very quickly switch to other leaders or have multiple leaders depending on the situation. Lakotas are historically the Lakota coalition tribe was a really good example of this, where you sort of had wartime leaders, peacetime leaders, and people sort of appealing to people like, hey, I've got this idea, right? It was more fluid in that way. That then leads us into chiefdoms. Chiefdoms are sort of the beginning of true power centralization. And I say beginning because most likely chiefdoms probably predate states as far as archaeologically speaking. Usually no true coercive control, but sometimes some coercive control, but less elaborate than a state, not like, a big, large jail system or something like that. Tend to be groups of thousands, and they have sort of some kind of officially designated leader, often but not always hereditary. Paul McDowell in the reading says, unlike the position of headman in a band, the position of chief is an office, a permanent political status that demands a successor when the current chief dies. That's a really key distinction. So a leader is not just a leader because sort of they're influential and charismatic, so people tend to listen to them, which is often the case in bands and tribes. You have like the big man situation in Papua New Guinea, where people are just sort of like, they're the leader, and people usually call that a big man, but it's kind of just because they're really charismatic. In this case, there's like a formal office, like there's a chief over this village or these several villages, and they come from this lineage, or in some other way, we have a formally designated way of picking the next chief, and it's permanent. Okay, so very, very different dynamic, much less of a, we just kind of choose our leaders when we want to and listen to them when we want to. This is more formal and official. Usually it also involves a bureaucracy, lower leaders, often lower chiefs that are like one chief, and then over lower chiefs, that's called a complex chiefdom. Now, notably, once again, the way we're using chief here is not the same as it sometimes gets used in contemporary tribal organization. Chief in this context has a very specific meaning for this anthropological theory of state formation. Wakwa, historically in what we now call British Columbia, are a very good example of this, where you historically had this, it was talked about in the reading, but like potlatch ceremonies, which allowed people to show that they were the leader of a specific village. Tragically, when many people had passed as a result of epidemics in the early 1900s and before, many of the chieftainship formal positions were left vacant, and so people were holding many potlatches to establish who was going to be the leaders of certain villages now, because traditional hereditary positions had been left vacant. So people that were more distantly related needed to establish if they were authority figures or not of that village. At least that's the dominant theory, or one of the dominant theories. But it is a complex chiefdom where you had chiefs over individual villages and lineages, and then they were kind of all interrelated with each other as many different tribes within this broader Wakwa identity. Chiefdoms were also prevalent historically throughout Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia, throughout the Pacific Islands. Tikopia is an excellent example, famously studied in a book called Read the Tikopia, This Political System. Within Tikopia, there were 4 integrated levels of kind of hierarchy, all of which kind of are ritual and ceremonial, but also political in a sense. The household has a husband who's the leader of ceremonies, 5 to 20 people, kind of an extended household. There's then a lineage or a paito with 40 people, again has a leader. Then clans, kainanga, there's an ariki, a leader over that group of several hundred people. And then the entire island has an ariki over everybody, who is regarded as kikifa, like a first among other arikis. Like, right, there's other leaders who are also really like equal in a sense, but he's sort of the preeminent one. In charge of what's sometimes called the work of the gods, sort of the ceremonies that help to rejuvenate the island and ensure that it is healthy and provides for the people. The clan chiefs had sort of control of specific pieces of land, and then you gave them food as sort of an offering to say, can I now farm this land, right? If the land belongs to them in a real sense, or at least is managed by them. They settle disputes and they impose taboo. They say certain things are forbidden in our society. So the connection of religious and political system there is really, really clear, right? That is not always the case. People sometimes think that, and that's just not the case archaeologically or anthropologically. There are many societies in which religious and political authority don't go together, but this is an example of one in which they clearly do. Hawaii, prior to US colonialism of the islands, is another good example of a chiefdom, but particularly interesting as a complex chiefdom where there's chiefs over each island. And then eventually, and this happened like in the last few centuries, one chief that line became dominant over all of the Hawaiian islands and thus was a monarchy, right? So you had queens and kings. So this just sort of shows us sometimes the blurry line between a chiefdom and a state. By 1810, they had a military force of roughly 10,000 over a population of roughly 300,000, with a hereditary dynasty that could say that certain things were forbidden or taboo. People had to respect them, for example, by like bowing when, or making sure you're sitting when the chief is passing through your village, and some degree of control over life and norms, by which I mean that the rulers could do things that the commoners could not, right? And a really complicated, complex, arguably bureaucracy where you had lower chiefs, district chiefs, sub-district chiefs, land managers, all the way down to your average farmer. So very clear stratification, very clear social layers. And that's kind of what that looked like. And about 90% of the land was owned by the leaders rather than the commoners, who then sort of farmed it out to commoners, if you see what I mean, rented out, as it were. The journey from sort of bands to tribes and chiefdoms and eventually states is one of progressive centralization of social power. And so the important question, and one that Graeber and Wengrow in that book that I had you read a part of, spend an entire 800-page or whatever book discussing, is sort of how it ever comes to be that societies that either don't have formal hierarchy or only have it for ceremonies or only have it kind of sometimes come to have very strict, rigid hierarchies that are permanent and enforced by force. How do things get frozen in that way, as they put it? There's a lot of answers, and probably it looks different in different times and places, but some common themes are such. Size. Larger societies tend to be more likely to have formal hierarchies and eventually develop into states. Ideologies. States tend to develop in situations where some people are thought of as having the rightful authority over others. Historically, that often had religious dimensions, but sometimes may not have. Sometimes it had more of like a war dimension, like that person like conquered a bunch of people and they're now the monarch, and rightfully so. Resource control. So specifically control over the means of production of shared resources. And so an example would be ancient Egyptian rulers that started controlling the irrigation system and eventually could set themselves up partly through that as pharaohs, or some of Amazonian societies where a similar thing happened. Conquest, right? Sometimes you become a state because another state takes you over, or you become a chiefdom or a tribe because, or rather not tribe, but a chiefdom because another chiefdom comes over. And geographic circumscription, interestingly, of the 5, probably the most surprising, but also makes sense if you think about it. We sometimes get chiefdoms, complex chiefdoms, states, in situations where a group of people either are like on an island or something where they can't leave, or they're like, here's the Nile Delta and you can leave, but everywhere else is not a very fun place to farm. So people are going to stay close to the Delta. In situations like that, it's easier for a leader to exert control, in part because there's less freedom of movement, right? Because sort of geography is preventing freedom of movement. And so it is easier for a runaway situation, social control, where one group starts to exert power and gets more and more and more because people can't just like leave easily. So group size clearly matters in that case, with larger societies tending to have more centralized systems. By centralized, I mean a ruling body with official authority to govern, as opposed to bands or tribes where you have no central governing body. A centralized system, like a chiefdom or a state, does. So I'm going to stop there for a minute.